And here we are with the new Edge Sword Sorcery short story chat panel thing. Round 3. This time, I'm joined by Jay Wolf and Matt Holder, and we will be discussing The Wolves of Winter Road, written by T.A. Markitan and published in A Book of Blades, Volume 2, this year's new anthology from the Rogues in the House crew. Yeah, Jay, why don't you give us a short introduction, and then Matt, you do the same.
Hi, I am. Oh, geez, I'm sorry. Hi, I'm Jay Wolf, editor and bon vivant at large. Um, and the next time we read this, I will be a published novelist.
Yay! Awesome. All right, how about Matt? Who the heck are you?
Hello, my name's Matt Holder. I'm mostly a teacher, but I also write. I do have a story upcoming in one of the Old Moon Quarterly. I think it'll come out in the spring of next year, so you can look for it in there. I also do reviews for Strange Horizons. You can find some of my reviews there.
Awesome. And I'm the slightly gassy editor. Sorry, I just had a Coke. Editor of New Age Sword and Sorcery and podcaster of So I'm Writing a Novel. And I'm chunking away at that titular novel, almost done outlining the goddamn thing. So maybe one day people can actually get to read it. Also, today I was messing around in Twine, the choose your own adventure writing software. Who knows where that will lead? But it was fun to dick around in, for sure. And it would be kind of fun actually if we tried to have a panel discussion about choosing an adventure story. I wonder how that would even work. Because like each of us would have our own experiences with
Would
it,
we
you
have to
know?
choose our own panel, or
Yeah, it's like I guess it would depend on how many endings it had, and then you could each discuss your own journeys, especially if there's only the one ending, that'd be a little easier, but that's a challenge for another day. Okay. So the Wolves of Winter Road. Basically, super mega broad summary. A couple of fellows by the name of Heath and Imrich, Heath being described as a red haired archer, Imrich being like the big warrior type, are traveling along a frozen, winter or journey across like a trade route, basically trying to get from A to B. And they're very concerned because they are getting low on food. Game is scarce. There's talk of big wolves which is always a little alarming. There's also talk of more superstitious things, which we'll get into, which eventually becomes relevant as it does in these kinds of stories. Pretty early on in the story, they meet a woman named Timora, who seems attractive and interesting, but also very strange. And why is she on her own? She has a story, but it doesn't entirely add up. And finally, there's some shenanigans involving a sorcerer, as tends to happen in these tales, and a big climax. I'm sure we'll discuss in detail as we get deeper into our discussion leading up to an ending that really tickled me and was a big part of why I thought it might be fun to discuss this story. Jay, why don't you share with us your sort of first general impressions of the story? How did it strike you?
so I really like the prose craft in general for this. It felt sort of like it was aiming for a sort of fairy tale vibe, which I think with a lot of the story elements that really kind of all slotted together really well for me. In terms of like that thing that we've talked about before where like the style of the prose that you're choosing kind of helps to build the world for you a little bit.
Mhm.
Um I feel like that was probably like the most effective part for me, at least to like set the stage for the story, to like go into it with the vibe of like there's going to be some supernatural elements and they're probably going to have a sort of a fairy tale vibe, I guess, is where I would go with that.
Cool. And Matt, what was your general first impressions, etc.?
My first impressions, I was kind of, like I said, I read it yesterday, and um, I was sort of mid, I guess, as the children say. On my first read, I think it did do a lot of things pretty well. I think there's like an economy of storytelling, as I think Jay was mentioning with the sort of fairy tale thing. I thought that the story built up this sense of dread really well.
Yeah.
However, the more I started thinking about it, both last night and today, uh, there's some more going on here that I think is really interesting in terms of like how it maybe plays with our expectations about these types of stories, because in some ways I did feel like this was sort of a very generic, and I use that word with the reference not necessarily to plain or staid, but generic meaning very sort of conventional um, sword and sorcery tale type tale of, you got two guys on the road, they meet some sort of creepy woman, uh, creepy sorcerer, some monsters, they fight, etc., etc. But like I said, I'm sure we'll get into it. But I think there is a lot more here that I sort of latched onto. The more I was thinking about it, the more I was getting going back through it again. So yeah, I came around on it.
Oh yeah, it's definitely a story that I had to come back to more than once to really get all the pieces of it. I feel pretty confident saying that like the first trip through the story was definitely just sort of like trying to take that again, like you mentioned, the sense of dread that was going on in the story and see sort of like the neat places where that's sort of tent poled throughout. Um, but it definitely took me a couple of passes to really like get what the story was doing. So I definitely I'm very sympathetic to that.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed it. I chose it for us to discuss for a bunch of reasons. One of them was the fact that, yeah, like it has, I guess, I mean, I guess you use the word generic or whatever, but yeah, it has a very familiar structure for sure. But
Classical.
yeah, classical. Yeah, exactly. But like that worked fine for me. It's because of what else it gets up to. You know, if all it had going was the surface elements, then yeah, okay, maybe it wouldn't be such an interesting story to discuss. But it had more going for it. And for one thing, I just found it fun, you know, in a way that I really don't often encounter. Where a lot of Sword and Sorcery takes itself, I would argue, too seriously. The story managed to have what felt like real stakes and real consequences, while still making me kind of chuckle and smile at points, which was really appreciated. It also was a little horny, which, like, weirdly, you don't encounter a lot in this genre that is known for barely clothed people and thews and all that good stuff. You know, I mean, as we all know across the history of it, there's a fair amount of people breasting boobily down the stairs, and other more skillful executions of horniness, and say the work of Tanith Lee. But by and large, I find it a curiously chaste genre. So I admit, like, I got kind of a kick out of the fact that the story does have kind of a sexual frisson to certain scenes, and you can interpret how it ends. The word family is invoked, but I don't know. It didn't. It felt like something other than family to me, almost like a romantic triad. But also, well, anyway, we'll get more into that when we
Can
get to
I
the end
throw in?
game.
Can I maybe put out the word pack?
Yeah, we are talking about wolves here. Oh, yeah,
As a wolf, um I've had a,
yeah.
I've had a lot of jokes flung at me over my long and staid career. So yeah,
Um,
just saying.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, actually, I'm curious. Was that just was that a me thing, or did you two? Let's maybe start with you, Matt. Did you two find that it was sort of novel that this story had like a bit of sexuality in it, and it was like working the plot? It didn't feel. It wasn't like boring male gazy stuff or whatever. Like, yeah. What did you think of that, Matt? Did you feel that when you were reading this?
Yes, and that is actually what sort of brought me back to the story and made me appreciate it a lot more. The story is like super horny. I wish it was like more horny. Like I wish there the sex scene is a bit too chaste in my opinion. But yeah, you're definitely right that this like SNS genre full of like, you know, boob ladies is it's written by a bunch of like really insecure, mostly white dudes who don't know how to write about sexuality, let alone treat it with any kind of sophistication or maturity. Like it never rises above the level of like juvenilia in my opinion. I mean, I think Tanith Lee is a great like reference for this story. I think like if I would think about like Trails of Influence, I don't know if it was being directly referenced, but this felt very Tanith Lee. But yeah, this woman that they meet, like these two guys seem kind of klutzy and dumb to me. Like they're missing all the tells, and they're that this lady is like not what she seems to be. But I think that when um she's a very sexual being and it makes them very uncomfortable and they can't deal with that, and that's what sort of brought me around to the story in terms of what it was doing. You had these two like big macho guys who you think are supposed to protect this woman, but like they don't know what to do with her sexuality. They're just sort of almost like falling victim to it, and they're sort of confused by it because I don't know, they're just awkward dudes, which feels a lot more realistic to me. Um, but yeah, that's I definitely get into that going through it again, and I think that's again what sort of brought me back to the story and seeing the sort of subtleties and depth that were in there from the jump.
Yeah, and I think it is kind of fun that she uses her sexuality to sort of, yeah, manipulate them a little bit, which is, a common thing, but the less common thing is maybe how it, like, she, as you say, is using it to make them uncomfortable and to kind of, like, sort of establish a more interesting power dynamic in the story. I think, I'm a fan of them, I write them sometimes, but, I think that there's a lot of, authors who would just go to something that would be a little easier, which would be to make her physical prowess as a werewolf be what is used to establish dominance, or to be like, "Hey, she's on par with these 2 guys as well, she can totally kill dudes." So I thought it was kinda neat to have it come at that from a different angle and in a way that didn't feel like it was written, like, I enjoyed it as a reader, but it didn't feel like it was written for me, a dude, do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, I
What do
mean,
you
like
think
I
about
said, the dudes in the story are kind of idiots, and again, in my opinion, and I don't, yeah, I guess I don't read it as very manipulative either. Like, I think she was just like hanging out and having a good time, and that one guy, Emmerich, I think, like she invites him like to basically have a threesome, and he's like, I do not, like he suddenly turns into like some really sheepish little dude, and he walks away, and then the other guy says that she's too forward, right? Like the
Yep.
one that actually slept with her, like they just they do not know what to do with this woman's like sort of forthright sexuality.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned that I completely agree with and was actually like sort of the boiling point thought for me was one of the little bullet points I made on my notebook is that in a very kind of stark contrast to the way that like the hypersexuality is usually portrayed in these things. Again, like there's like a lot of the breasted boobily kind of ladies, or else things to have a tendency to be very, very chaste. One of the things that I thought was interesting is that unlike, say, his vet in Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, for example,
Mm.
um, the sexuality of uh, this character Tamora is
Gamora, yeah.
not, she's not using it to hurt anybody. She's just sort of like, she's obviously not socialized in the same way that the men are. And that was something that I like immediately pinged for me, like, oh, like there's something very different going on here. But she never really uses that sort of sexual power like in a manipulative way or a hurtful way. She's kind of using it to like help them understand her, and they're kind of bouncing off of it because they're dudes. Um,
Well,
so this
a
was
certain
actually
kind of
something
dude
that
for
I
sure,
really
yeah.
felt very like comfortable with, and like I immediately understood what was going on because I have also been that awkward person trying to be like, hey, hello, hi. And so that was actually quite relatable for me in that regard. And at the end of the day, like she's never actually used any of either that or her wolf powers for that matter to really like to harm the fellas in the story. She uses them to defend them in the ending, but not
Mm.
not to hurt them, like to save them, which is again, I thought it was very cool.
Well, that makes me wanna leap ahead to something. So, the ending.
Hmm.
Uh, for anybody who hasn't read it but is listening and doesn't care about spoilers, which you shouldn't if you're listening to this. Basically, there's that big confrontation with the sorcerer, which we may get into in more detail later. And by the end of it, the fellows are not doing well, badly injured, not doing well. And Tamora has these things that are introduced early in the story called moonflowers, which are quite valuable, and they can be used to heal, but only people with here, what does it say here? Yeah, the healing power of moonflowers only works for those of ancient blood, but I will give you mine. Oh ho, it's almost vampiric in the sense of like giving them blood, bringing them into the club, and making them essentially.
Right.
I'm not even sure if they're werewolves or if they're just wolves at the end, which is an interesting distinction, especially considering, quote, Emmerich tried to speak but could not form the words. Um,
Yeah, I
so
feel like that was left very open kind of on purpose.
yeah, yeah, no, and so I'm not asking for like a definitive answer, but like, did you feel? Let's start with you, Jane, and you, Matt. Did you feel that the ending with her and her new pair of wolves, her new family, right, to replace the one that she says was killed early on, although that story is quite possibly spurious. Um, do you feel that that had kind of like a, I don't know, a happiness to it, or that it was more like kind of a vaguely unsettling horror where you're like, well, I guess it's better than they died, but
For me, it was like hopeful, aspirational, in the sense that like you cannot survive this experience without being altered by it. And I feel like that's pretty true to a lot of sword and sorcery. I think that there's like a 50-50 on it. Either you get a hard reset every book, like again, like Fafhrd and the Grey Mouser, or you're kind of like doomed to continue onward, slightly worse than before, like Elric, for example. Um, and I feel like this was kind of interesting because it played with some of those tropes, but ultimately it creates, at least from her perspective, it sounds like there's a net positive to be gained there. But I don't know that I would necessarily want to live as a transformed wolf myself personally. So,
fair. How did you feel about the ending, Matt? How tonally did it come off to you?
To me, it seemed like I would agree with Jay that it seemed cool or good vibes in the sense like there is a sort of potentially horrific aspect to it, I suppose, but they had basically died anyway, so she was just saving them, and now they can hang out as wolves and stuff. And this is another part of the story that is like pretty hot and heavy, like the sort of exchange of body fluids, which you normally associate with like vampirism, which is why that's like Dracula's like the hot one.
Mhm.
But there's a kind of like earthy, earthy sexuality here with the sort of werewolves, which are often associated a lot more with like earth and musk and dirt. Um, but she's giving them her blood essentially. So again, pretty another sort of exchange of body fluids.
So
But
do
yeah,
you
I
feel it
liked
was
it. Like
ultimately
I
a
said,
positive?
I didn't think it felt like horrific. I didn't feel
Mm.
like that was the intent. We don't get to know. All we know is the red wolf let out a low whimper, and I guess you can read that a couple of ways. Whimper is usually a word associated with kind of patheticness or sadness, perhaps. But I don't know.
Resignment and defeat. But
Yeah,
I think that's also yeah, I don't know. I kind of left it with like it felt open-ended enough that it didn't necessarily strike me that they would always be wolves either.
Really?
Um it seemed like certainly she has the ability to not always be a wolf. Is it possible that they are going to have that ability, whether it's, accumulated over time or, you know, just that she's invited them into her supernatural existence, and has not given them permission to refuse, which is
Yeah.
definitely back to that sort of like saucy, sexy kind of aspect where it's like the forbidden, etc.
Yeah, it's interesting you say it felt open ended to you because, like, you know what it is really, but I don't know. When I read it, I'm just used to thinking like, and the universe ends at the end of this page, or whatever. A lot of short stories, and so in my head, I was like, well, they definitely don't seem sentient, and they definitely don't seem like they can transform, and one of them's whimpering. Hmm. And this was like,
Oh, I
I don't
mean,
know if it was coercive, but the big question for me is, was this the end game she had in mind when she saw them on the road at the beginning of the story? Was it like, you know what? I'm gonna find one way or another to convince these guys, whether I have sex with them and then convince them one night, hey, it'd be cool if you were wolves, or if we see what else happens on the road, maybe I'll strike it, when opportunity arises, as it did via the wounds they suffered in the battle with Bullard the sorcerer. Yeah, I think maybe there's no clear answer, and that's part of what makes it, I think, a more interesting and a more thoughtful story. I really feel like
oh yeah,
Tia
I
Markin
feel like
here.
now that you've kind of blown it open for me because I hadn't even thought about it from the perspective of like that she might have been doing that for any reason other than like, well, it's better than letting them die.
But remember the beginning, she's like, "Oh, I my family got killed," and of course she sort of fizzes a bit and says they were killed by wolves. But there's also talk early on of there being a lot of hunters out trying to deal with the wolf problem. So My feeling is potentially like what's being inferred is she lost her family and she's like, well, shit. I mean, I'm a wolf. I gotta have a pack. I can't survive on my own. For all the talk we have of the wolves in fiction. Oh, hey, there's two strapping young bucks. Let's see what we can do with this.
It's definitely a
She
really
tries
cool and interesting inversion. Oh, sorry.
What's that
I
mean?
feel like I
she
might have.
tries to give him her little moonflowers, which is sign number one for these guys, and this is why I think they're kind of dumb. Sign number one that this lady is not exactly who she seems. The other one is when she like eats the rat whole or whatever, the mouse or
Yeah.
whatever, and they're just like, yeah, that's normal. You must have been hungry or whatever.
It
I'm like,
wasn't
y'all
weird
are
enough
like,
for them, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, who knows, right? Maybe in the sort of faintly medieval setting, they've seen a real hunger and that could inspire someone to do something like that. Hunger is
Yeah,
a
I mean, they
concern
are
there,
at
as you
war.
before.
So, like, that part I was able to suspend my disbelief slightly simply because war does really fucked up things to you. And
Sure.
especially as a bystander and as a woman, I have to imagine that would have been really fucking horrible.
For sure. And so with all that, like I found the ending, it skewed horror, but for me it was not a clear cut 100% this or that. And it had that kind of like, hey, I guess things worked out, kind of happiness tinge around the edges of the horror. And I guess, yeah, it all comes down to like whether or not you think what she was doing was premeditated, whether or not you think like, yeah, these guys might eventually get to walk on two legs again and make their own choices, or if they're stuck as they are, if they're her pets, as much,
Mhm.
yeah, it's open to interpretation. And I think that's a big part of the strength of it, and the fact that yeah, no matter what, I don't think you can really say the ending is entirely one thing or another, but it's a more curious mix that makes you want to kind of poke at it and think about it after reading. So yeah. Um, we mentioned the supernatural, and like it's just a small detail, but I think it's kind of interesting to discuss perhaps how very early in the story, they're talking about really grounded concerns, right? They are cold, they are hungry, they got to get down this path before the snow gets worse. These are things anybody who's reading, if they have spent any time anywhere with a bit, even a bit of cold, can be kind of like, okay, yeah, I get this, I can relate to this. Um, but then there's talk of like, oh, it's supernatural stuff and no deers and what's the line? Gosh darn it. Yeah, one of them was like telling them, "You mock," but because Imrich is chuckling and being like, "Don't tell me, Wilder folk and forest spirits, ooh la la," pardon me, Heath is like, "You mock, but we'll see who laughs when some spiteful shade turns us both into toads." So first of all, fun foreshadowing because they do get turned into, well, not toads but wolves, um, but also just this thing of like, one of the reasons I personally really like a lot of sword and sorcery is I find on average in the genre, the characters are superstitious. And there is this idea that you don't just accept that the world, like you might all believe it in the same way you kind of like expect, at least as modern people looking back through history, those ignorant people of the past, to just believe in a general sense in sorcerers and dragons and whatever the heck else. But it's this feeling of like the day to day practicalities. Oh, those are just stories. And I really like that a lot more than when you read a fantasy story where just what we would consider the fantastic elements are just life, right? Sorcery is just a technology. Everybody rides a dragon to work, whatever. So I guess reason I'm bringing this up, aside from the fact that just I kind of like it when superstition is brought into an SNS story because it helps blur the line of what may or may not be real, and it makes the story more ambiguous and interesting to explore. Do you guys feel that a sword and sorcery story on average is better for having characters who are superstitious and perhaps even get it wrong about what is or is not real in the sense of the fantastic? Or does it matter to you whether or not, the characters are superstitious? Jay, why don't you answer that first?
Oh, yeah, I think belief systems in general and sort of superstitions and other accumulated human foibles are kind of mission critical to creating good characters, I think, in terms of making sword and sorcery like sufficiently weird that
Mhm.
you need to have, that you need to have people that have been in this weird world and have had to come up with coping mechanisms for it. Um, for want of any other way to put it. Um, the idea that like not just like fantasy religion with a big trademark next to it, but the idea that you have like a series of little beliefs that you have accumulated through your experience of the weird that I think sword and sorcery does really well in general. and I feel like this story is a very good example of.
Awesome. Matt, how do you feel about all that?
Um, I don't know. I guess. I mean, I guess part thinking about like the Conan stories, part of what I think makes the sorcery sort of work or make it seem sort of weird or unsettling is the his own feeling toward it, and that he is a very sort of grounded person, and it feels unnatural, and he's scared by it. So then you, the reader, sort of associate it with scariness. I mean, I think that is one of the, I guess, markers of the genre relative to like broader fantasy is its understanding and approach, like the dichotomy between the kind of grounded, almost like realism or naturalism of the characters and their world, which is closer to like historical fiction, and juxtaposed with the the fantastic, right? That sort
Mhm.
of that contrast is what lends itself to the kind of telltale hallmarks of the genre. Um, but I don't know if I sort of feel strongly one way or the other. I mean, I mentioned Elric was a big influence for me, and that's obviously a very different approach. Even though like
Mhm.
um, the magic's still very dangerous in Elric's world, and definitely not like plus. I do like the sort of the sorcery approach from Sword and Sorcery. I like the idea that it's like corrupting and that it's sort of uh because to me I always read it as sort of analogous to like knowledge, and I think there's something compelling about sort of the pursuit of knowledge almost for its own sake sort of becomes destructive. Uh, so I don't know. Just rambling at this point.
Okay, I actually thought that was a really good thought. I also come from like closer to Elric than Conan, like philosophically in terms of sword and sorcery. Like
Mhm.
it's not that I don't appreciate the Conan stories, but certainly like where I got started in sword and sorcery was, I mean, strictly speaking, where I got started in sword and sorcery, just to wrap it around with the wolf thing, is ElfQuest,
Ah,
um, which is essentially a sword and sorcery tale about a band of elves that ride wolves, and then it goes really sideways from there. But in terms of Wendy Peeney was the first exposure that I had to Elric, just because she had done some Elric work and actually published a book of her Elric illustrations
hmm.
that were originally done for a film that she was going to do when she was in school. And so like that was sort of my entree into that world. And so I come to it from a slightly more I hesitate to call it romantic, but sort of like a slightly more like a slightly larger embrace of the sorcery part than the sword part that some people sometimes find a little confusing. But anyways, yeah, that whole element I think is really laced really well throughout this short story. I feel like the magic here is definitely kept very supernatural. It's never explained. It's never given a system. The nearest we have to that is her moonflowers thing, which I thought was neat and kind of an
Hmm.
elegant detail. And it again sort of played back to the fairy tale thing. But yeah,
Yeah, I agree. See, okay, so I'm in the minority on this panel. I came to Sword and Sorcery originally through Savage Sword of Conan.
yeah.
So very much through the thews, not books, sort of end of the spectrum. And I don't think there's any wrong place to
Oh
be
no,
on that spectrum for
there is a
sure.
little bit of a jocks and nerds thing going there.
I mean, I love Elric. Hell, I've been fortunate enough to get to publish a new Elric story.
Yes,
Um,
yes. Oh yeah, no,
but
it's just funny. That's all.
yeah, yeah, no, for sure. And I think, yeah, that maybe there's, yeah, maybe jocks versus nerds, something like that. Yeah, yeah. Because, yeah, I do love the fantastic elements, but I mean, one of the reasons I personally just fell the hell off of what was then contemporary fantasy in sort of the late 80s through the 2000s. And again, I mean, I'm making a very broad statement, so there's going to be
Eh,
exceptions to this, but by and large, I found the fantastic felt less fantastic because it tended to be more just in the reality of the characters, especially when you have demi-humans charging around. Um, and I then would read these Savage Sword of Conan issues I had and just be delighted to see this hero who was so tough and capable and interesting. occasionally be like, "Oh my god," and be terrified when he encountered a supernatural element. And to have the supernatural elements, sure, sometimes like it's a giant snake, okay, sure, but a lot of the time they were not something that felt like they fell out of a D&D monster manual or whatever, or fell out of anything else that I was, familiar with. And so I felt like it was more curious. It's like I had to think harder to figure out what might happen, or more accurately, it was easier for me to turn off wanting to figure it out and just like enjoy the story, right? And I found that even in this story because it has, I guess you could argue, a stock monster, right? The werewolf, and there's been many interpretations, but hey, we all know what werewolf is broadly speaking. There have been some good werewolf stories in Sword and Sorcery before, for sure. Um, Cold Night, something like that. It's a Kane story. If anybody in the chat wants to help me out here. But yeah, there's a Carl Edward Wagner story, something Cold Night, god damn it, that has also to do with a werewolf situation that's quite entertaining. And the fact that it's a werewolf and not like an obscure cosmic horror or
We
whatever
have typing.
doesn't defer. Pardon me?
Oh, so there's typing.
Yeah, yeah, Reflections in the Winter of My Soul. Thank you, Javier. So that is the story I was thinking of, and I won't say much more about it other than the fact that it's a werewolf story, and you can figure that out pretty early on, much like with this. Like, you can kind of guess the broad strokes of what's going to happen with Tamora, but it doesn't take away from the story at all. And the fact that we're familiar with a werewolf, I don't know, it doesn't bother me the same way as if they ran into a bunch of goblins with +1 short swords or whatever. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think too, like that's also again the kind of fairy tale element of it for me was that it was a monster um that it occurs in different spaces. Because you have a very traditional view of werewolves, but then like they also do appear in like fantasy romance and a whole bunch of other spaces that you maybe wouldn't expect them to.
And they massively predate D&D. So
Yes.
there's less of that feeling, I guess, that, yeah, as I say, you get
Yeah,
you
they're
get a bunch of
classical in
goblins
a
in.
way that some other monsters aren't.
Yeah, like, they can tie into gothic horror, which, of course, was Carl Reitner's, big thing. So, yeah, no, I think I really enjoy the way the supernatural is handled in this, and I don't think it's a coincidence that, the term fairy tale keeps cropping up, which I'm totally into, and I think that also plays, around with the ending too, right? Being slightly sinister, but also, maybe it kinda worked out, like, that feels almost more like a lot of fairy tale endings to me, than, say, some sword and sorcery tales. I noticed that none of us is really, like, and of course I'm leading this conversation, so I guess I'm largely guilty for this. But none of us has talked a lot about Bullard. Let's start with you, Jay. Actually, no, I keep picking on you. Let's start with you, Matt.
Ah.
Did you have any thoughts about Bullard? Anything you wanted to bring up or discuss or just share?
Not really. Like, I think part of probably why we're not mentioning him is I think he's kind of sort of one note, or at least just like I don't think there's much going on there other than I'm gonna read the description here. This is on. If you're turning your hymnals, please, to page 15. A plump, cheery man sat camped on the side of the road. An unadorned walking staff lay next to him, along with two large packs stuffed with what presumably was every item he owned. A glint of gold winked out from beneath one strained and bulging flap. So he's kind of this, I don't know, almost like, uh, I don't
He's
know,
very stock
sort of a,
fantasy, yeah.
yeah, stock fantasy. He's associated with like money right away, so I'm already sort of not on his side. And then I don't know, like I be honest, I can't even quite remember. Like he's some like he and Tamora like know each other or something, and he shows up later with his hobrats, which I super love, by the way, the hobrats. Mostly because I love that name. Speaking of D&D, that feels like straight out of like some old TSR, like early '80s, monster
Hmm.
manual, or whatever. I
Well, but
super
those
love the
monster manuals were largely out of sword and sorcery novels. So,
yeah
This is
that's you
true.
have
I
the
should.
your
hobrats.
yeah.
But otherwise,
Sorry.
yeah, I don't have too much to say or contribute as far as like feelings on him. I mean, he's like sort of the bad guy.
Yeah. He
I think
felt
the more
cannon
interesting,
foddery from his appearance.
yeah,
Yeah,
And
he gets to be
I feel
both
like he
a.
was used just enough. Like he was kind of he performed his purpose in the story from a structural standpoint,
Mhm.
and he didn't like overstay his welcome. He popped up and did what he needed to do so that the more interesting things could happen.
Yeah, I think that's a fair way to put it, and actually just before we lose that, it's true, the early D&D books were massively influenced because of the Appendix and Reading List, which was like 3 quarters full of sword and sorcery authors. Um, I should clarify, I suppose, when I use that, like when I say like D&D Monster Manual bracket derogatory, I tend to be thinking of later stuff like Fifth Ed or whatever. But yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
you
no,
get the
just the
idea.
TSR specifically are like so heavily influenced.
Right down to
Unavoidable.
stats for Elric and other characters. I think showed up in some of the earliest
Yes.
stuff. Certainly Dragon Magazine, but I
There
think some of the Hmm?
there's like a beautiful thing in terms of all of like Warhammer Fantasy is the same way, but also like
Yeah.
TSR stuff. Like in the beginning where it still has that like sort of punk edge where it's not codified, like it's still supposed to be pretty like DIY, like what do
Mhm.
you mean rules? Like what are you talking about kind of thing, right? Like that would have been their ethos. And then as it goes on, obviously these things become like codified to death, and that's usually what people react against, right? And that's where like sort of D&D really now is as far from like what you would maybe consider sword and sorcery as possible because of how codified it is, whereas sword and sorcery is much more in that weird fiction vein of like you don't like codifying these things sort of defeats the purpose, like it's sort of antithetical to the
Absolutely, yeah.
purpose
Yeah.
of what you're doing.
Yeah, I realize that it's very easy to snark about magic systems, but God, I hate magic systems.
Yeah, to me,
I
they're
don't yeah
antithetical to the point of the fantastic because it's making the fantastic mundane. Now you need a
Like,
system for a
yeah, it's like
game, but you
I
don't.
wanted I wanted fantasy math,
yeah
fantasy
Yeah.
physics.
I think yeah, there's like I've read and I like everyone talks about Brandon Sanderson, like he's the dude when it comes to, and I feel like, and I do actually enjoy his stuff, and I feel like he has a shtick and he knows what he's doing, and I think he does it really well. But I
Mhm.
think everyone sort of takes the wrong lessons from him in the same way that everyone sort of took the wrong lessons from Tolkien.
Yeah.
Like he built a world around like a systematized magic system, whereas I think a lot of people now sort of just assume like, oh, let me start with like the magic rules or whatever, and that immediately I'm just like, well, what are we even doing anymore? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah, kinda like, as you say, Tolkien people being like, "I gotta fill 10 moleskins with, world building before I can even decide what the story is." You know?
Exactly. It's like, how about you go get a PhD in language and then go write your novels? Okay, why don't we start there?
Yeah, whatever you do, don't start
Like
with a
if
fun
we're gonna
idea and a
rip off
character.
Tolkien, like go read the old Norse poems, like actually read what he was influenced by.
Yeah.
Um,
I
but
I
that's
I will
me.
confess to being very guilty to being one of those people who has 10 moleskins full of stuff. But on the flip side,
Oh
I've
yeah,
also
I mean we
informed it
all,
with many more things than just Tolkien.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Uh,
Oh, it's all good. I'm not trying to identify, like, the
oh
bad
no,
ways.
no, this
Just
is
saying, like,
fully me
we all
going
have
like my
potholes we
face
get
is
stuck
turning
in.
very purple right now.
And
I have
actually
been
before
seen and known.
I'll bring it back to Bullet and Sorcery in a second, but I just want to say one thing that I find kind of amusing about the relationship between SNS and D&D is I feel like there's been this kind of back and forth going for a while where like D&D, came out in 74, 79 we get the Appendix N that makes it more explicit, like the strong SNS influences on it. But then you get the early 80s where like there were other reasons SNS died, and that's a whole nother conversation. But I do feel something that contributed to it was when D&D, mainly through the red box, like blew up and became a lot more easy for people to get into and understand. And as much as it took from SNS, like because you have a band of adventurers, you generally have a fellowship, right? Like I think it evoked Tolkien a lot more between that and stuff like that and the demi-humans to people at large. And then the people sort of thought, okay, well, that's fantasy, right? And then you get those kind of expectations feeding into fantasy publishing. And so you look at contemporary fantasy changing, especially around the mid 80s onward, into being something that is very much not at all SNS. And then, D&D gets more and more codified, as Matt was saying, and then by the time we get to the early 2000s, like D&D looks very different at 3.5. Definitely doesn't look like SNS. Most contemporary fantasy doesn't look like SNS. And you get, what do you get? You get this reaction, right? You get maybe Howard Andrew Jones and the New Edge trying to bring Sword and Sorcery back, right? And you get the OSR, which is like, hey, let's go back to that early pre-codified D&D when like it wasn't quite so whatever codified. And the big one there that I always think of is Goodman Games with Dungeon Crawl Classics, who put the Appendix N in the back of the thing, and their whole ethos is we're trying to recapture the Appendix N, which again includes a lot of SNS. Lo and behold, Goodman Games publishes Tales from the Magician's Skull with stats in the back with Howard as editor. And Howard goes on to inspire a whole bunch of people, including myself, between Howard and me coming across learning about the Appendix N in the back of Dungeon World Classics. Here I am, a guy, who's founded his own magazine. And so we have this third wave, hopefully, kicking up of SMS and just like, round and round it goes. I want, and also there's multiple systems right now aimed specifically at evoking the SNS feel, right? I mean, DCC does it in a broad sense with Appendix N, but you get like, yeah, there's a whole bunch. Maybe I'm going on a bit of a tear, but I just think it's kind of neat how it's been back and forth, and I wonder what the next shift will be in this conversation between SNS and tabletop role playing games. Um, but yeah, Bullard, yeah, as you say, Matt, Bullard comes in to do a thing and he does it, and I think I'm fine with that. I think I'm really fine with that. I honestly don't know off the top of my head, anyway, how much I would mess with Bullard. Like Jay, I'm gonna put you
Oh
on the spot.
yeah, no, it's fine.
Make
It was
Bullard
funny because I
better.
was
Do it.
just thinking about that. Like, there's a thing there's a thing that goes into writing a short story that's specifically a short story. And one of the things that you kind of have to do is um, kind of a complicated arithmetic of like, how complicated are the elements of the story and what elements can I simplify? And I feel like to to her credit here, like specifically, I think simplifying the villain was actually really smart, because making the villain complicated here would have made it a lot more challenging to have both like a complicated figure in Tamora and a complicated villain. Like, you would have to spend so much more page space on complicating both of these people. Whereas in the way that it's presented here, she can just be strange, and the strangeness is kind of its own mystery that pulls the reader along. Um, and you don't actually really think about Bullard at all, because he's just like he's so like obviously not good that you don't really need to know in what ways he's bad until they're at the final fight.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that's a very good way of putting it. Like, honestly, Bullard is not a problem, and he doesn't need to be solved. He's here doing what he should be doing, and there's got to be economy, right? Like, I don't think a Book of Blades has a word limit, but yeah, like whatever. Like, at some point, you just want to be like, okay, this is as long as I want the story to
Right.
be.
At some
So
point, a short story becomes a novelette, and at some point, a novelette becomes a novella, and at some
yeah,
point, a novella becomes a novel. So, like, at a certain point, you sort of have to. And this was, I'm trying to think of the exact phrase that it was used when I was at VP. But one of the instructors was basically sort of like, the more complicated this element is, the more simplified that element has to be. And I feel very strongly about that, that sometimes people try to approach a story like this and try to put too much wild stuff in, and then all the wild stuff just kind of like doesn't have anything to hang on to. Like, either you
Mm,
need a solid structure that you can hang interesting things on, or you need an interesting structure with uncomplicated details. And I feel like there's a really good balance of that in this particular story.
I completely agree. I had a story in Whetstone last year that was basically a fight. But keeping it that simple let me have a lot more fun with the details and made it
Yes.
interesting through those. If you yeah, it's like if you try and make everything special, then it just gets over complicated. Like, is if you did complex engravings on every single inch of something rather than just the border, yeah, it becomes hard to see everything and crowded. Um,
I
yeah,
think
okay, well,
there's
go ahead, Matt.
another like Bullard is also he's like the bird, right? And so he's that magpie that he keeps running into.
Hmm.
Um
Yeah.
and I think that is kind of a brilliant way of sort of like, and it's something that like I'll definitely think about writing my own, but like, because when you see that revelation, because the magpie is like one of those moments of like uh where the story does a good job of building this like sense of unease and dread, and the magpie is one of them, and then to find
Mhm.
out that it was this dude this whole time sort of like retroactively cast this whole thing over the story. And I think it's a really, again, like efficient and economic way of perhaps making him more sinister than he might have been otherwise, to know that like he was sort of there the whole time and he is part of that structure of dread. But it's so, I mean, it's like one line, right? It's like a phrase
Really
where you
subtle.
find out that he's the bird. But it is a
Mhm.
really like sort of masterstroke in terms of like how you can kind of keep your villain sort of pretty interesting and sinister without, again, sort of having him go into some elaborate backstory monologue or something. Or again, like y'all were saying, like if he suddenly started spouting off a bunch of stuff, that would completely suck the energy away from like what the story is actually about, which is this woman and the way that she kind of uses these men, perhaps, or relates to them. Like, I don't know. I still think there's something. I guess I wanted to ask what y'all think about the sex scene here. Hang on, let me
What
find
page
where it
was
is
that
because
on again?
I was this is on page 23. I was thinking again as we were talking about the ways in which there you can read this in a lot of ways, and I think on my first as I was reading it, I was thinking like, oh, this is like, sort of a kind of sex positive like thing where the woman has this sexuality that's really off-putting to these dudes. Um, I wonder what y'all think. So this is on page 23.
Mhm.
Let's see. Uh, everybody, everybody, hold on. This is right in the middle of the page. Um,
Is it the part where she says, "Come join
caught,
us"?
come join us. Her amber eyes seem to burn with their own intensity. Caught somewhere between temptation and caution. Emmerich stuttered for a reply. Maybe later. I better check the horses. Her smile grew faint with disappointment, but she shrugged and resumed favoring Heath with her aggressive attention. Heath waved a hand and tried to get out a response that was muffled by Tamora's hungry kisses. Emma wasn't sure if it was an acknowledgement or plea for help. And I think there's a way to sort of read that as sort of funny because I mean Heath's fine, perhaps, right? He comes out later and he's like, she's really forward, and I'm a little
Yeah.
unsure. But I don't know. There's still a way. There's a space in there. I think that you can read. Like perhaps there is something like, and this is right after like he tries to get on top of her, and she's like, "Nuh-uh," and then she flips on top of him and sort of exerts this kind of force over him. And again, there's a way you can read that as like sexy and uh, sort of redistribution of agency. But
Mhm.
there's also maybe a way that you could read it as more sinister. And I don't know. What y'all think?
Yeah, I mean, she is a werewolf. It's one of those things that when you come back to it, yeah, as Fred's
Yeah.
saying in the chat, that's her being wolf-like. When you reread the story, say reviewing it for a panel discussion, definitely it comes off a little different. I definitely the first time just read it is like gentle humor and a bit of like, yeah, let's have something a little different than the guy leading or whatever.
Right.
But looking at it now, I'm just thinking like, yeah, like this is actually sounds vaguely threatening.
Oh yeah, I read it. I would say that I read it as like again another element of the like kind of I hesitate to call it supernatural because it's very natural, but like in terms of like things that are off-putting or unsettling for them, that
Mhm.
definitely was one of them, and it kind of differs like it creates that sort of like there's something unusual happening here energy that I thought I found it super effective for me. And I think overall like it kind of it did kind of tie into a lot of the sort of fairy tale elements in the sense of like I would say almost like touching up against some taboos,
Mm.
like playing with expectations but also playing with like the social rules of um I mean like in terms of like just that whole thing where female desire is generally treated as suspicious or otherwise manipulative, and in this case it didn't really feel manipulative, it just felt like unusual. And
Mhm.
again I thought it was very effective but yeah.
Yeah, like
It
I found it kind of
definitely
like, it was a little thrilling to be like, oh, hey, there's some actual
yeah.
like sex happening in one of these SMS stories I'm reading. And also like, yeah, maybe a little amusing, but I don't know. I say this as a for my sins, a Russ Meyer fan who loves the tagline, too much woman for one man. This idea of
Yeah,
women just being like tornadoes that tear through the lives of the male characters.
right, and
Yeah,
there's
I
definitely sort of like a yeah there's definitely sort of an element of that that's I'm sorry, I didn't mean to like interrupt, but I the thought just sort of hit me as you were saying it. Sorry.
yeah, that's all
But
good.
yeah, that specifically that treatment of female attention is just so like whew, I don't want to call it weird or unusual because I wish it wasn't weird or unusual, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, but it's kind of interesting actually. Fred just put something up in the chat here saying they're being pulled out of their comfort sort of slash human zone into another one, and
Yes, they're
I
being
do.
pulled into the portal of the fantasy.
Yeah, we're getting to that liminal Fey realm, except in this case, it's aggressive female desire, which at least for these guys is another world.
The real fantasy.
Oh dear. Okay. Well, I have really really enjoyed discussing the story. We've been at it for almost an hour now, so we should probably get to winding down. Okay, people in the chat, if you have any final questions or comments, please think about them or type them out now while we hear first Matt, then Jay's final thoughts on the story. Matt, is there anything you sort of just to wrap up your thoughts about the whole thing, or anything we didn't get to that you would like to share with us?
I think I said most of what I wanted. I mean, I think it is an interesting story about like predation and prey. And can y'all hear me?
It
Can y'all
was a
hear me?
little faint though.
Yeah, eat the mic a
Okay.
little maybe, but yeah, we can hear you.
No, I liked it. Like I said, my first read through, I was kind of you know, ho hum, but thinking about it a lot more the past again, like 24 hours, I think there is a lot more depth here that I really appreciated, and it definitely makes me want to check out more of this writer's stories. I don't know how to say their last name, Markitan.
Marketing,
Um,
let's go with that.
yeah,
Sorry for messing it up.
apologies. But but yeah, I think it does. I think there are some, again, thinking about. We said it a few times, like the economy of storytelling. I think there's a lot to pull here. Like if you are a writer, tricks and ways that you can sort of move things along and establish your characters very quickly in a short amount of space. But yeah, check it out.
Right on. And Jay, any final thoughts, comments, questions, etc.?
Um, I feel like we've pretty much covered everything I had. One note that I did want to make, just because I did reference Quest earlier, is that the wolf woman's name is Tamora, and I am desperate to know if it's a reference to ElfQuest. Because it's one letter off of one of the wolfiest characters in the series.
Oh,
Um,
interesting.
and so like, yeah, now I'm kind of fascinated. And it just occurred to me like now as I was flipping through the book, I was like, wait a minute. But yeah, other than I feel like we really covered everything that I had on my docket, and uh in general, yeah, I just thought this was a great story and a great example of ways that you can approach classic sword and sorcery storytelling with elements that are contemporarily popular, such as fairy tales.
Mhm. Yeah, I feel too that we've covered everything. Certainly, I wanted to discuss. In the chat here, we got Fred saying this discussion showed more than I saw when I read it, and I'm glad he said that because yeah, that's kind of how I feel too. Like I did enjoy it enough to think yeah we should chat about the story, but certainly through the discussion, like we've drawn out stuff that I found I hadn't first thought of or hadn't thought about in any great depth. So I'm really glad we did this, and maybe we should do more of these chats. Huh? Who knows, eh? And definitely, like I've read a little bit of her work before. I think this shows improvement as a writer, and I think that's always very exciting to see. I'm very curious to see whatever she writes next, and definitely like I really enjoy the story, and I appreciate it a lot more for us having given it the kind of attention that we SNS heads so often reserve almost exclusively for the classics. So yeah, this is pretty good. Um, Oh, in the chat, Kevin says, I'm pretty sure on the Whetstone server, the author mentioned 80s Elric and ElfQuest were her first exposures to SNS. So that Tamora reference is quite possible. Okay,
I
cool,
that
cool.
feels so plausible to me. I'm leaning hard on it. In which case, like that actually just like my heart just went like, "Woo." I'm very happy.
Nice. I don't know if she's on our server, but I should definitely, if she isn't, I should send her an invite. Yeah.
Yes.
All right.
Yes.
Okay. So again, thank you both so much for making time in your evening to discuss this story. Thank you to all of you in the chat for attending. Most appreciated and for sharing your thoughts and stuff. Yeah, I think I would love to do this again. So far, we've had three, and they've all been pretty good. I think. So I have a story that I would like us to discuss that I think could get us to some interesting places in general for discussing SS. On top of, pardon me, SNS. On top of it just being a darn good tale. And in fact, tale is in the title. The story I would like to propose for next time is Dara's Tale by Mark Rigney, and this was roughly in the middle of Tales from the Magician's Skull, issue number 7. It seems fitting that we finally discuss a short story from a magazine. And what magazine to go to, of course. The Skull is a real, just burning bright, light in the scene. So yeah, issue 7. It's even if you can't get a physical copy because that's not always easy with. Pardon me, that's not always easy with the Skull. It is available digitally, very affordably. So yeah, pretty easy to check out. And as far as when we do it, oh, I don't know. Let's say Wednesday, November 22nd. Let's go with that for funsies.
Sounds
All
good
right.
to me.
I will reiterate that in the server to make it easier for people to check it out. Meanwhile, if you're hearing this on YouTube later, thanks for hearing this. Please check out the magazine, the new edgeswordsorcery.com. And again, you can find this story in particular in A Book of Blades, Volume 2, available on Amazon in soft hardcover and digital, if I remember correctly. And you'll even find a little story by me in there. Bonus question mark. All right. Thank you all for joining. Kevin, please feel free to cease the recording.